Join me as we visit St. John in the Wall, Bristol, a church built into the city wall. On the way, we pass the Bristol Cenotaph and a statue to Neptune. For contrast, some modern graffiti. The church, built into the city wall, is the only survivor of 4 such churches. The portcullis channel is clearly visible in the main arch. From the width of the slot, it was a strong structure. A big lock needs a big key. The main entrance from Nelson Street. It is not the original doorway. This was cut in the 19th century. I find no information on the arms above the door. The organ is a 2-manual instrument by Vowles of Bristol. The first recorded rector is William Beand, appointed in 1285. Looking along the church from the choir gallery. A brass commemorates Thomas Rowley and his wife, circa 1478. He was a co-founder of the Guild in the Crypt. The Church of St. John is believed to have had a complete set of stained glass windows. The medieval glass that remains is purely fragmentary, with little possibility of restoration. Medieval glass shards have been set in a clerestory window. One stained glass window by Bell of Bristol represents Christ flanked by St. John the Baptist and St. Lawrence. In the eastern bay is a polychrome tomb chest decorated with carved and painted heraldic shields. Above, the recumbent effigy of Walter Frampton, Dogged Feet, the benefactor of the church. 19th century Minton encaustic tiles clad the floor. In the sanctuary, the tiles contain attractively executed symbols of the evangelists. The front of the galley has 7 arched panels, on which are painted representations of Saints Peter, Matthew, Luke, John the Baptist, Mark, John the Evangelist, and Paul. A look around the bell-ringing chamber. The current ring of 6 bells date from the period 1649 to 1785 and are in good ringing condition. This is an apparatus for 6 bells, which allows one person to ring a change. There is also a small bell used to call parishioners to service. We return to Nelson Street to be able to enter the crypt. Check open days or you won't be seeing the inside of the church at all. This is the tomb of Thomas White, Churchwarden 1533, Mayor of Bristol 1530, who died 1542. There is an alabaster tomb chest to a good unknown merchant. Take a last view down the crypt before we say farewell to the Church of St. John's in the Wall, Bristol.